Hello and welcome. My name is Martine Mango, and I am the co-founder and CEO of Seedbox Digital, which is an online, full-service, fully integrated online marketing agency. And today I'm really excited to bring you guys our very first webinar entitled Like It or Not, Social Media and Mental Health. Well, many of us enjoy staying connected on social media. Excessive use can fuel feelings of anxiety, depression, isolation, and FOMO. And for some of you guys that don't know what FOMO is, that's the fear of missing out. So today, we're actually going to touch on how to modify our habits. We're also going to touch on how to improve our mood, emerging technologies, AI, machine learning, as well as resources that are available to you. So if you guys are ready, then we're going to jump right in. So if you guys will join me in welcoming our very first guest. Our very first guest hails from actually Massachusetts. Her name is Miss Lujuana Milton. Welcome,
Thank you,
Lujuana.
Martine.
Thank you for joining us. Lujuana is a licensed clinical social worker and therapist, and she's the owner of South Shore Child and Family Counseling, serving the South Shore area of Greater Boston and beyond. So thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And we have a second panelist, and I'm actually going to invite her to the stream. Her name is Miss Babita Spinelli. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Martine. Hi, Lujuana.
Hi, Babita.
Hi. And I have their information down at the bottom as well. We'll be switching it out throughout the program. So if you guys want to find them, you can find Lujuana actually at sscfc-braintree.com and Babita at openingthedoorsTherapy.com. Babita is a licensed psychoanalyst and psychotherapist with offices in Manhattan, New Jersey, and Florida. She's the owner of Opening the Doors Therapy, as I mentioned before, which is down there below. Thank you guys so much for being here today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I actually thought we would open up from a passage from the book entitled Digital Minimalism by Cal Newport. And in the book, he says, and I quote, "Until recently, it was assumed that addiction only applied to alcohol and other drugs." And he defines addiction as substances that include psychoactive compounds that can directly change your brain chemistry. However, a mounting body of research suggested that behaviors that did not involve ingesting substances could become addictive. An important 2010 survey paper was published that appeared in the American Journal of Drug and Alcohol Abuse and concluded that there's growing evidence that behavioral addictions resemble substance addictions in many domains. So actually, I have one more guest. I apologize. I'm going to open up the floor for questions, but let me introduce our third panelist. Hi, Sean.
Hi, everyone. Nice to virtually meet you. Hi, Lujuana and Babita. I've heard so much about you. I'm really looking forward
Hi,
to
Sean.
Hey,
I'm here.
Yeah.
I'm going to give you a proper intro if you don't mind, Sean.
Sure thing. Yeah.
Mr. Sean Batier is the AI principal at the Department of Defense Army Research Lab and the technical AI advisor at Mind Valley. Thank you so much for being here, Sean.
Thank you for having me. Yeah.
Yes. So actually, we're just wanted to open the floor up with a question. And the question that I wanted to ask is, what specifically makes new technologies well suited to foster behavioral addictions? And I want to actually point the question to Lujuana, because we talk a lot about addiction, talk about coping mechanisms. What is it about these emerging technologies that makes it so hard for us to put our phone down?
So there's a growing body of research that shows that that much like addictions to gambling or substances, that it triggers kind of like the dopamine receptors in your brain that then work within the circuitries of the reward circuitries. So like how we interpret rewards, and much like addiction, like a gambling addiction or a substance addiction, we need more. Right. So dopamine kind of gets flooded into our system. And when it gets flooded, we have no more and we need more. We want more. And that's how addictions get started. There's a growing body of research that shows that social media usage or online internet usage actually triggers some of those same dopamine receptors and those reward circuitries in your brain that continue to foster some of that behavioral addictions piece. So much like someone who may struggle with gambling, a gambling gambling addiction, you're finding people who struggle with social media or their online presence because neurologically or physiologically there is as a response.
Got it. Okay. So with that, no, thank you for sharing that with me as well. So I guess to kind of further piggyback on that a little bit more, I was wondering if, let's say somebody that has experienced trauma, right? And we're seeing some of these things on social media repeat. Now, I know 2020 has been a particularly difficult year. It just seems like there's trauma after trauma. But let's say you're somebody that's actually struggling with that. How could social media even fuel this, or, you know, to an extreme sense, maybe PTSD even?
That's a great question. Basically, to piggyback on what Luana said is, when there is someone who's also experienced trauma and they are leaning towards social media and they are ingesting a lot of negative news, they're ingesting violence, rage, all sorts of things that can create, depression or anxiety. What can happen is that individual that has had trauma in their life will internalize what they're taking in, what's in their feed. And what happens is it can manifest in PTSD symptoms because they have then absorbed all of that negative information that could connect to the trauma that they'd experienced early on in their life or even more recently. So, for example, there was a really powerful quote that I'd read, which is, I can see myself being, brutalized over and over again, or I could see myself being killed over and over again as a response to what individuals are taking in. And that really is what happens with regard to trauma. I think the other part is just to make that connection with addiction. When someone has experienced trauma, they might also lean towards what's fostering the traumatic event, that sort of a trauma response, right? It may be an unhealthy coping mechanism, but that's what happens. And so it will then repeat right into a PTSD symptoms because they will keep gravitating towards it over and over again.
That's really interesting. I was wondering even, well, let me take a pause real fast. I want to throw some statistics up real fast so that we can kind of just look at exactly how many people are on social media worldwide and really how many people it is impacting. And it seems to be that obviously younger generation has a little bit more of the, they're a little bit more involved. And I don't know if what these numbers, how true they are, because 3.5 billion, I'm sure people have multiple accounts. I actually wanted to raise the question to the group because it seems like social media is everywhere. Are you guys on social media, and what is your go-to platform? And how do you keep yourself from, oh my gosh, Babita, you brought up the idea of doom scrolling. I would love to talk about that. But even before we jump into doom scrolling, what platforms are you guys on?
I mean, I'll jump into that and then I'll defer to everybody else. So Facebook, Instagram, Pinterest, LinkedIn. I'm not so much on Twitter. And I think what I do around it is to parse out what's the part that's unhealthy, what's the part where I want to make sure that there's meaningful content, something of value that I feel individuals might need, and ensuring that that's what I put out and being more intentional about it. I have individuals that manage a lot of my social media, and I tend to make sure that I'm not constantly looking. And as a mental health practitioner, I try to model what I'm trying to advocate. But I think we can utilize the platform in a meaningful way, and for a way that kind of draws in what audiences, a healthy way for audiences in terms of what they're taking in. So that's how I sort of limit it and manage it.
Okay. What about you guys, Lujuana and Sean? What platforms do you guys use often?
So the platforms that I use typically are Facebook, Instagram, and Pinterest. For me, I think if I were to pick one that I utilize the most, would most likely be Facebook. And what I try to do is I try to honestly limit as much as I can. So like I'll go on for a little bit. I really try to to make sure that I'm not on for long periods of time. When I am on, I try to be mindful of how long I'm on, and how many times I do go on. So I try to kind of manage my own like mental health with regards to social media very, very mindfully and intentionally when I'm on the social media platforms. I find during the day I use Facebook the most, and at night I typically use Pinterest, which is weird. I'm a Pinterest user at night, Facebooker by day.
And what about you, Sean? Because you're coming from a completely different angle. You're coming from machine learning background, AI background. So has that colored your usage of social media? Do you feel like you use less, more? Like, what does your usage look like?
Yes. Well, about a decade ago when I was in university, I definitely digested social media. And I think, it was very timely because that was around the time that Facebook was really taking off, like 2010, 2008, that whole era, right? And I actually was just part of that community. One of my very first internships was actually mining through people's faces on Facebook, not at Facebook, but like at a research institute. And it's fascinating because, that platform is a huge wealth of data. And a lot of us sort of just quickly assign our data openly because of the convenience it gives us. And, to just address that directly your question, I'm pretty active on, Instagram, which is part of Facebook, and and LinkedIn. So even professional networking systems that we use are, flavors of social media.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that, Sean, because in an earlier conversation, I hadn't really connected LinkedIn as much as a social media platform, but you're right, it absolutely is. I saw it more as a professional networking tool. And there's a little bit more of, I think, a sense of control, though, in LinkedIn in terms of their, their settings and what you can look at. But you're absolutely right. It is a social media platform.
Definitely. And, but Bita, you had talked about, you've published a few articles on the concept of doom scrolling. And I was hoping you can kind of touch on that. I know, for me, certain platforms, you may see certain types of news versus others. So hoping you can kind of let us, enlighten us as to what doom scrolling is and, how do we protect ourselves from doing that?
Oh, yeah, I would be happy to. This is like such a hot topic. It's interesting. So it was actually the word was first tweeted somewhere, the rumor has it, around 2018, but nobody really picked up on it. Now, when Merriam-Webster's dictionary picked up on it, it was during COVID. And doom scrolling, so let's start with what doom is, right? Doom is annihilation. It's like judgment day, right? So there's nothing good about doom, right? No matter what anyone says. Scrolling is when we're surfing. So the definition of doom scrolling is one's tendency to surf or scroll through bad news, even depressing news, negative news, and to keep doing it in the feed. And the way that this actually kind of came to fruition or came to light is during COVID-19, when we were all sitting, in lockdown and uncertainty, people found themselves scrolling more and more because they were seeking clarity. They were trying to find a way to find answers, right? So it started with everyone looking at what number are we? What states' numbers are increasing? What are decreasing? How many deaths are there, right? Then when we started to move into other spaces of uncertainty that were going on in the country and unrest and BLM, it also became people seeking answers, wanting to be educated, right? But what started to happen is they started to ingest all of this negative news. And it then started to create a lot of anxiety and depression. So doom scrolling is basically going down this rabbit hole of negativity, and then it has its negative impact on one's mental health.
It's really hard when you want to stay informed. How do you know you're doom scrolling in the first place?
It's, it is difficult because what's happening is we don't have a mechanism, right? So there are platforms where you can just not have the newsfeed. It's just there. So we do have a lack of control. And so people actually don't know. It goes back to the addictive space. All they know is that they want to search and things just keep popping up. And one of the interesting things that I had read was a few years ago when there was scrolling, it was about scrolling to see, oh, when's is Game of Thrones going to have a 5th season, or they're looking at other things. There wasn't so much negative news. There wasn't so much unrest. We weren't in a pandemic, et cetera, et cetera. So now it's changed, and there is a penchant. There's research that says there's a penchant for absorbing negative content.
Yes.
People do find themselves, so people will continue to do it. And so that's what distinguishes it from regular scrolling to doom scrolling, and why it happens now, but why we don't even realize we're doing it.
That's really fascinating. It's fascinating because we have so much time on our hands. I'm personally making a lot of discoveries. I'm actually spending way more time on social media, I think, generally. And I wanted to bring up the topic about face apps to you guys as well, because I'm spending more time online and I am comparing myself. Oh, are you? Oh, gosh, how are you? Oh, excuse me. Oh, excuse me. If we are spending more time on face apps and we're comparing ourselves to other people, what does that do to our psyche?
Good question.
That is a good question. I think the biggest thing is like acknowledging the fact that like we are constantly comparing ourselves. And so like even with face apps, it's really about thinking about kind of like what could you be different? How could you be different? What can you be doing differently? And it brings up this concept of comparing one another, and how does that impact like our self-esteem and how we view ourselves? So that's like the first thing that kind of comes out for me.
Right.
Yeah, I would say that what ends up happening a lot with face apps is we have a generation of individuals that are much more body conscious. There's becomes such a concern around appearance and that connection to physical appearance and wanting to look perfect. I mean, I would say that's like a pandemic under the pandemic, basically. And so they're like working on themselves, and these face apps are literally encouraging something that actually is mentally detrimental, because there's leaning towards being perfect, looking a certain way, etc. And it's really impacting our youth very powerfully. And I would imagine Sean has a lot to say on this topic.
Yes.
Yes, yeah. It's very interesting because I wanted to sort of follow up also on what you had said, Babita. The nature of these face apps, and Lujuana and Babita, you both are so on point when you mentioned that this is driving people to want to look perfect, and the desire of positive reinforcement of looking perfect, right? It actually adds color to this whole addiction language that we have, which is like, invariable reinforcement, right? So we were just talking about doom scrolling. And when we take the doom scrolling, which is negative feedback, but it's just so like macabre and grotesque, and I want to look at people suffering. And then you also want the validation, right? That flavor of just like, I am so loved. I look perfect. I have put on this mask. That mixture, or the amalgamation of both the positive and the negative valence as variable reinforcement, lend to extremely effective addiction strategies, right? Because variable reinforcement, as I'm sure you both know and have probably studied for many years, is sort of the root in changing a reward that's given. And since the timing is also often unclear, it drives that gambling behavior, or that like I need to compulsively check my messages and scroll. And I've been so guilty of it myself, just going through the 2010s. Yeah.
Yes, completely.
I actually have a question from YouTube. Let me see if I can put this here. This one comes from Katarina. She says, hello, I'm loving this event. Thank you, Kata. How do you think social media can increase the chances of imposter syndrome on young women of color starting their careers like me? How can one take care of their mental health? And that's really for anybody.
Well, I mean, I can definitely speak to it. I'm sure everyone else will have something to say. What a great question, Katerina. Thank you. Yes, it does. Because what ends up happening is if we already have within us, some challenges, which, many of us do around self-worth or self-esteem, right, that we're working through. And then we are looking at all of these feeds and all of these people posting, looking perfect, right? They're doing all of these things and they're like leaning in and they're making an impact. And we're already sitting there wondering about our own self-worth or not feeling good about ourselves. It will then encourage us to feel like, are we good enough? And then if we're sitting there feeling like, are we good enough? We then wonder whether or not we're a fraud. Like, is what we're doing matching up to other people? So it then ends up encouraging the imposter syndrome. The other piece of it is this: when we feel like we're competing or trying to be in a space where there's all of these other people putting content out in our peers, right? We then find ourselves trying to do the same, trying to search for those things to be valuable, to put things out, to be seen in a certain way. And then we sit back and we wonder, is this really me? Is this really who I am? And then that imposter syndrome kicks in.
I second everything that Babita has said. And I think the other piece is, like, especially with social media becoming so much more visual, right? Like, now we have a vision of how we should be or how we shouldn't be. And I think that also plays into, like, do I look that way? And it feeds into that imposter syndrome. I think the other piece too that, social media speaks to is, like, shame. There's a lot of shaming on social media. If I don't do it this way, if I don't work hard enough, if I'm not hustling, if I'm not doing it the way in which this influencer or this person says, then am I doing enough? And which I think contributes to imposter syndrome. And it makes you feel like you're not good enough, which contributes to mental health effects, the significant mental health effects.
Absolutely.
So, and very fascinating, because this appeared with the conversation of face apps. Martine, you actually brought this up to me, I think, in a past conversation we had, but we had discussed how face apps are the production of a mask, right? And it's fascinating because this concept of mask evolves to a next level digital twin, that projection of who you are that's actually divested from who you are in the real world sometimes. And it's fascinating because as our technologies are becoming scalable, with 5G being able to, handle the Internet of Things devices, as we, are recently seeing the IPO of companies like Unity, which is a virtual reality platform. It is very real that, the language that we have around the production of digital twins, and of taking a real world and creating a virtual world out there, that is coming in this next decade, in the 20s. Like, this is something that we really need to become more mindful of. And I think this intersectional dialogue between people who, are building out these platforms and people like both of you here, it's like so essential, because we are going to only continue the need to address this. Yeah.
And I think it continues to foster this, like, if we have kind of these people who have one image online versus how they are as in person, right? I constantly say to, like, people who are comparing themselves, especially with, like, imposter syndrome, is like, all that glitters is not gold. And so a lot of times, like, who's going to put out all the negative things that happen in their life? Everything is kind of like rosy on social media. And then it contributes to feeling like, what am I doing that my life isn't put together? What am I doing that I'm not able to travel the way I want to travel, or have this perfect family that, like, this person has, when we're not really seeing the other side of it, like the real side of it. We're actually seeing just a polished image.
Absolutely.
Yes. And actually, to add also to both of you and what Sean, you were saying, which is why I think it is something of concern, is if we look at masks and we look at digital twins, we're then looking at people splitting themselves off. And what we work on as therapists is integrating ourselves, feeling comfortable in our own skin, but feeling like we can have an integrated individual, not masks, secrets, splitting off. What digital twin does is creates an entire other life where you've now split off your authentic self into this whole other reality, which is very concerning. Like, what is that going to encourage in people?
That's a really good point. And actually, that is a really nice segue into a video I would love to play for you guys. Mr. Sean Batir actually has a YouTube channel, and in it, he discusses the Face apps, AI, and I would love to just jump right in. So we're going to take a quick break. We have a 4-minute and 40-second video, and we'll see you guys on the other side.
Hi everyone, my name is Sean Batir, and in this video, I'll explain to you why FaceApp, a popular application that can change the features of your face, is something that you should probably avoid or at least be concerned about. I'll tell you the truth behind the terrifying FaceApp. Now remember last year when the internet was filled with this? The famous hashtag FaceApp challenge was the most trendy thing for like several weeks. Millions of people uploaded their face pictures to get to know how they would look like as male or female, young or old, or even with a beard. I guess you've also done this challenge or at least played with FaceApp for some time. The results of aging or changing gender on the pictures were fine, but not perfect. Just fine. And now, after almost a year since that challenge, FaceApp is back and the results are shockingly better. And here's why. The facial recognition algorithm that works in this app literally eats your face picture and remembers every detail of it. Your face gets represented as a matrix, and everyone's face matrix is unique, literally a grid of numbers. The app then digests this matrix that it eats, like that weird black monster from Spirited Away. The more that the FaceApp algorithm gets food, aka your picture, the bigger and better that it becomes. Suddenly, your identity becomes another numeric matrix representation that can be copied, altered, or grafted onto another human being, or an entirely staged fake video. And how does it work? At its most basic level, the numbers in that matrix are changed just ever so slightly. That linear algebra that you zoned out of in middle school, high school, or college? Yup, that is at the root of all this face tweaking. And now imagine, what could happen in the future when the AI algorithm behind FaceApp will get billions and billions of pictures of not only you and your family and friends, but also of our world's leaders, celebrities, and influencers. In case you were wondering, then you guessed it. This type of data can be explosive in the hands of somebody who might want to make a deepfake featuring you. These are real risks that all of us alive today, millennials, Gen Z, and what? Generation Alpha, are facing and will have to deal with. Wow, okay, so that was terrifying. But that aside, let's be real. I am personally very interested in AI, and my goal is to make machines that augment humans, even improve them. Just because there are some risks involved with technology doesn't mean that I'm telling you to just go back and live in the forest. Just know what's up. Like, remember Tony Stark and Iron Man? Well, I think a key first step is building out a tool like Iron Man's Jarvis, and there are some fantastic companies out there working on this exact problem. I love the potential and the benefits that can be brought to AI by humanity. But at the same time, we all should be extremely aware and use discernment about which apps and technologies we use for personal purposes. And for those of you who use FaceApp, well, it's important to know what you're signing up for. Now, I'm not singling FaceApp out necessarily. They've actually released a public statement describing how their system works, and if you trust that, then it's not so bad. When an app processes your image on the cloud, it's actually just offloading the work to happen in a place that isn't on your actual phone. So yeah, when that image is temporarily in a cloud server for 48 hours, is it at risk of being weaponized by a bad actor or hacked? Yeah, but that isn't exclusive to just FaceApp. So is the majority of our data that is now cloud-based. It's stored in either AWS, GCP, or Azure. And most of what you do to make your life more convenient has some element of cloud-hosted database. And most of that has some risk involved, no matter how marginal. That's actually why cybersecurity is so important, super cool, and definitely a hot field to look into if you're watching this video and curious about how you want your future to unfold. Now back to security. The key message is, know what you're signing up for. Use your discernment, your common sense, and actually read the prompts that iOS and Android give you. They're technically supposed to let you know how your data is collected, if it's going to get collected, and maybe what it will be used for. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you liked it, please subscribe to my channel and give us a little like. Also, I'd like to ask you, do you think AI is a savior or a harbinger of doom for humanity? Let me know in your comments below. The best comment will be featured in next week's video. My name is Sean Batir, and I'm on a mission to build human-like robots.
Hi, guys. Welcome back. All right. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes. Yeah.
All right.
Yes.
Wonderful video. Thank you so much, Sean. That was wonderful. And you asked a question at the end of it, and I thought it was pretty interesting. Do you think that it's a savior, or do you think it's a harbinger of doom? And I think you really kind of touched on all the points there. But I want to just open it up to the group and just ask, what do you see with the future of technology? I know that there's actually some apps out there now that are introducing therapy. So I see doom and gloom for both. Matter of fact, I was watching Terminator last night, and I thought about the same subject. But it really begs the question: is the technology? Do you feel like it's advancing beyond ourselves? What we're able to sort of comprehend. We're in a place right now where I think we can agree that depression is a big issue that we're dealing with, and that it's said that these rates are probably going to go up because as people are spending more time inside, they're not able to go out and do things that maybe they may do for stress relief, go hike, go for a swim, whatever you do in the summer to have fun. So, I guess that was a pretty loaded question, but it's really two parts. My question really is around, what do you guys imagine for the future of technology? And do you think that we're able to keep up with it and evolve with it, co-evolve?
Maybe I'll start first. I would say, look, it's like almost as if the two parts of technology. One is Sean's video, as I was watching it, right? And you so aptly pointed out, there's a lot of exciting things about it. And we do want to see ourselves as evolving, right? I keep thinking, you were looking at Terminator, I keep thinking Blade Runner. I mean, it was so long ago, and now I'm like literally dating how old I am, right?
I love that movie.
Right? But it's
There's
like
an
that
update,
excitement, or like Star Wars, right? There is. And so we do want to lean into the part of it that can be very good and meaningful, the part of it that takes us into an evolving, futuristic society, right? That's expanding what we know. Yeah. The other part of it is, I think what we're all talking about here, when we look at it in terms of depression and anxiety, is where, one, we don't have control in particular platforms and what that does to our brains, literally. What we're absorbing because of what's happening out there in the world, and then what's being highlighted. We're not getting everything. A lot of the focus is around some of the negative things that are taking place. And the other part is, how are some of the platforms being utilized? So it's not that technology is this really awful, bad, monstrous creature. It's just that, is it really being used in the way that it can be? And then how are we taking what's good and positive about it and balancing that out so that it's not all about the pieces where it's heightening the depression, the anxiety, the search for connection? Are we finding balance in it with the good parts of it?
Now, sorry.
No, I was going to say that that's what I teach people in therapy, right? Like, that's what we do. We try to teach people to pull out what is serving them, or what's causing them happiness, or what can create happiness and being satisfied with their lives. And then the stuff that doesn't. And there's a lot, I mean, like you mentioned, there's a lot of good that comes from this technology. There's a lot of positives, but the stuff that doesn't, how can you facilitate that and like be mindful about like not putting that so much on your plate? And that, like you mentioned before, Babita, it takes intentionality and being really mindful about what you're consuming and what you're not consuming.
Now,
sorry. Oh, yeah, just to sort of like add to that point, I think one of the ways to operationalize this, how do we actually make people be more discerning? How do we help people understand how to observe the good that we can gain from AI without, damaging our psyches and our entire culture and generation in the process? I think the importance is to have people who are trained, right? Like as therapists, as people who understand sort of the value of mental health and also ethics. And those conversations need to be had with more regular cadence between, engineers and scientists and therapists and mental health experts. Because the fact of the matter is, like, we don't have that feedback loop necessarily. And I mean, this might be a little bit of a stretch, but similar to how science and spirituality had like a massive schism, like during the alignment period. Like we're seeing that too in terms of like the self versus how our technologies impact the other. And so this reunification and the draw, the thread between people who are experts in looking inward as well as people who are experts in looking outward, the scientists and mental health, those need to come together. And that really happens by, having conversations like we are doing. So thank you, Seedbox Digital and Martine. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And and like some of our, institutions that we live and move and operate in. For example, in 2016, when I was a PhD student at Columbia, we had a really cool meeting where people who were working on like neural implants that were flexible and could move in your brain were in the same room as people who were discussing like what are the ethical impacts of AI. And it was a very, very powerful experience. And I think that we really need to encourage this everywhere, because it's through conversation that I think we can let that free flow of ideas avoid having us remain in the bubble of our unique, paradigm and perspective. That's how I think we can definitely begin empowering ourselves and everyone around us. Yeah.
Beautifully said. I don't know about y'all, but I'm sitting here like so energized by what you're saying around that integration and not working in silos.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Right. Definitely. Bring the science and bring the mental health together.
Yes. Well, actually, we have quite a few questions that have come in through YouTube. So I want to transition, and actually in the same vein of talking about deep fakes and masking, we have a question from Christina actually about fake news. And in it, she says, "Hello, everyone. With the elections around the corner and lots of fake news on the internet, I'm curious about how one can protect themselves against this and against these bots."
If I could jump in, I think the biggest thing that I usually will recommend to people is do your research, not believe everything that kind of comes to, comes in front of your screen. I think we have to do our due diligence and like find out what is real and what's not real in this, because there's so much stuff that is out there that is misinformed, not true or blatantly false, and really kind of doing your research and like really figuring out, is this something that is real, or is this like partly false or false altogether? So I think the biggest thing I tell people is just do your research.
I would add to that too. Yeah, and just say, as you're saying, Luana, pick a reliable source. I always recommend pick one or two of your reliable sources. So after you do your research and you narrow it down so you're not bombarded by all of that, fake news, etc., and then choose with intention what those sources are, and then look to that to try and diminish the noise of everything else. And that even means individuals that that are speaking or coming up as well, right? Who you're talking to about it and exchanging, communication with about it. And if you narrow that down and say, okay, these are the two, resources that I think are reliable, and that's what I'm going to look at, or a podcast I'm going to listen to or read, and that's it. Like, set a boundary.
I can definitely agree to that. I work in social media, so I'm all about boundary setting. And yeah, I know that there's a time to turn off, turn on. And I definitely agree with you on on doing your research and making sure that it's a reputable source. That's highly important. Anybody today can produce something, but you want to make sure that from a reputable source, they're actually able to tell you where they got their sources from. So, I mean, I can definitely agree to that. And there's a big issue with people spreading fake news. So thank you for bringing that question up, Christina. I have actually another question from Kata, and she says, "What do you think is the impact on the mental health of people when using apps like Tinder? We're looking for relationships and partnerships. Do you think the way people find love has changed?" Good question.
Oh, yes.
Very good question.
As a relationship coach in this area, an expert, I may start off on kicking this one off. Yes, there is an impact on mental health, and I think the piece is this. It's called, like, what is that immediate satisfaction one is looking for when you're on, let's say, an app like Tinder, where you're swiping left or right. One, we're almost looking for this immediate satisfaction of, okay, this person looks good, let me just go there, right? And that's how we're defining, relationships. The other part is, what is it like for on the other end of it? And I think what's coming up in the work, and Luana, you're like nodding your head, yeah, is that self-esteem issue. Am I liked? Am I not liked? And that really also impacts how we see ourselves, which then impacts the way we lean into a relationship. The other part of it, I think, is this: in a pandemic, this is now elevated because there is less of a balance of more of that human connection or exposure. Even though things are opening up, there's some individuals that are still holding back, right? Understandably so. Everyone's being very careful. And so now Tinder's become almost this lifeline around that connection piece. So there isn't that balance. So now we have this whole other level during a pandemic of what this means in terms of the relationship space. So we're just utilizing it more so and almost dependent on it because we're not balancing out, maybe meeting someone else elsewhere.
Well, if I make my digital twin, just kidding.
To speak on that a little bit more, though, I think even pre-pandemic, it changed, right? So like, I think most oftentimes people like, back in the day, I think people found their partners, usually it was through work or through kind of a social situation. And we found that like, that was changing with the advent of like social media dating apps, that now people were utilizing it much more. I think people were utilizing the technology more. It was easier. It has less of that interaction, right? Like you can eat, that's where the term, like I think ghosting came up, right? After the advent of dating apps, where you don't have to have that awkward, like interaction at work with someone that you like went on a date with or went for drinks with, and that was it. And now you have to see them every day. Now you can see someone on the other side of the state. And if you wanted to see them and it didn't work out, you could just ghost them and never ever talk to them again. And it created this like weird social dynamic, even pre-pandemic.
I've heard somebody describe it as drinking out of a fire hose is like being on a dating app.
Yes, and also to like hook on to that, what this whole conversation is reminding me of a scene from one of my favorite movies is Vicky Cristina Barcelona. It's by I think it's a Woody Allen film. Yeah. But yes, and Penelope Cruz's character actually, she says you have chronic dissatisfaction at one point. And this concept of chronic dissatisfaction, I think, is very powerfully tied to the way that many dating apps, not just Tinder, but I mean, Cupid, maybe Harmony, like not to single any one of them out, but one of the incentives of a dating app should be to get us out into the real world, right? But naturally so, the way that these websites can often become more monetized is by increasing usage. How do you increase users? And so by giving people suddenly this wealth of optionality, it promotes this concept of chronic dissatisfaction. It's like sort of a second order consequence that might not be initially observable. And so we are seeing this appear, like I'm sure we all have friends, or maybe we may at one point in our lives have been guilty of thinking, oh, I really love the person I'm with, but what if they had this, this, and this? Because when you were single, you had this entire shopping market of people, right? And so this is the reality that we live in now. So
you know what, Sean? That brings up a whole big topic, which we could probably spend another hour talking about. But to say, yes, what's also happening is there's an increase in infidelity. There's an increase in divorce. The chronic dissatisfaction as it connects to being able to reach out to so many people out there, whether it's through a dating app or otherwise, right, is now instead of turning towards the present or who you're with and trying to foster that, there's always the escape, the option of someone else.
Now, I just want to throw these numbers back on the screen real quick and ask the question, just to kind of piggyback off what you just said, Babita. Do you think that that certain generations may be more impacted by this? In other words, would a younger generation that may be a little bit more media literate because they grew up in technology, do you think that they may be slightly more protected against, being able to sort of differentiate between, what is this and what is that versus somebody, let's say, of a different generation. Maybe they're not. Do you understand what I'm saying? Like, do you think that is there any correlation in some of these rates when it comes to generations, or no? Just because I'm looking at these numbers
I
here.
would say yes, but I would be curious what everyone else thinks. I would say yes in the sense of this. Baby boomers were not ones that actually relied on or didn't have any dependency around technology. And so for some of them, they may not even be technically savvy. And so there's sort of in some ways in sort of this sort of safe space as they continue the more traditional ways of communication and connection. And they're starting, to catch up, but that's not sort of how it all sort of started for them. And and sort of again, then you end up having like Gen Xers. Similarly, we were like sort of again just on sort of the brink, not necessarily on the brink of it, but it's sort of moving along. So we sort of balanced both spaces, and we're just even really excited when everything like the iPad, came on. And then you've got, millennials and then Gen Z. What I'm finding is they're more used to it. And so they are more inclined to be able to be drawn to it. And it's a way of them connecting. It's become more normalized for them, even in school, et cetera. There's a lot of things where things are being done through Facebook groups. That's how they do their projects, et cetera. So they're used to leaning in on the platforms and sort of taking more space in it.
I think you bring up a really good point, Babita, because I think that, I see kids a lot in my practice. And what we find is like kids are on there as young as, as young as infants. Like they're put in front of screens. I had a little one once going on their parents' phone and going on YouTube and literally scrolling through YouTube, picking a video. The child couldn't even speak. Like literally had no verbal, but could pick out a video and the videos that they liked. Wow. And it really highlighted how much like we are. I think it has its benefits. I'm not trying to say it doesn't have its benefits, because I think sometimes it helps with like, you have something to do, put on YouTube really quickly. Or there's some wonderful educational things, but I think especially Gen Zers and millennials, from a very young age, they were placed in front of technology because technology is everywhere. Versus of some of the older generations where we were able to, like, we knew a world. I knew a world where there wasn't social media and there wasn't even online. Versus like some of these other these younger generations where that's all they knew.
Right.
Yes, we're at like a very beautiful and interesting transition point, because the next 100 years will be the final 100 years where we have a mixture of people who remember the world without internet and the world with, right? Like, and particularly the ubiquitous spread of it, because I also at least like was able to have, my first decade of life without it. But, what you just said, like someone comes into the world and by the time they could begin making not even verbalizations, but just stay upright, now they have access to the entire world in front of them. It's wild.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well,
I think.
Sorry, continue.
I was just going to say, I don't know whether it was Forbes or someone else came out with the concern about interpersonal connection because of technology and I think particularly they were talking about Gen Z. Around it. So yes, Sean, to your point, there is something to be said about the last 100 years.
I wanted to also just make a note that on our YouTube, Eddie just commented that please note that some of these issues were around during chat lines. This is true.
I remember that.
Yes. Great point. Yes.
So we're coming down to the final 10 minutes of the hour. And so I just wanted to kind of wrap things up. I wanted to ask a couple of questions. The first is, we spent a lot of time talking about, the negative things about social media. There's wonderful positive things in the future. And I just wanted to know what are some positive things that can come out of this that you guys are looking forward to? Because I could speak for myself. So I see, as a career marketer and as somebody that really tries to practice digital minimalism, I do think that technology can evolve to kind of help us out a little bit more. I have seen a rise in apps used for therapy, but as we know, it's not the same as a face-to-face interaction, and we lose a lot of the communication. But I like the idea. I think it's a great start to what's to come. Also, my husband and I, we were in Houston when Hurricane Harvey hit, and because all the 911 lines were completely bogged down, people were using Facebook to save people. So I think that there's a lot of, I don't want us to completely leave the conversation and to leave it as it's a negative tool. I think it's a very positive tool, and wanted to pose the question to the group as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think to add to that, helping to reduce the stigma around mental health issues and around therapy. And we can see that through social media, there's been a lot more reach to be able to open up the conversation, to be able to normalize, that we need to take care of our mental health, to be able to look at how we can possibly do that, and to be able to know that there are different platforms and ways people can reach out when maybe it feels like therapy is a little bit too expensive, where, there
You're pausing a little bit, Babita.
are other.
Okay. I'm going to, I'm sorry, you cut out.
That's a real plus.
Okay, you cut out just at the last part.
Oh, so I was just saying, so that's a real plus in terms of how social media has had a positive impact with regard to normalizing mental health issues and to remove the stigma, which I think we're all consciously working on right now.
Yes.
I second that, Babita. I also think, too, social media has created wonderful communities for people to feel connected, especially if they're within their own communities. I'm thinking of kind of LGBT youth who may feel like isolated. I'm also even thinking about some of these movements that have started online and through social media, and how we're able to, some of it can be considered doom scrolling, but also like being aware of what's happening, and how it's kind of fueled some of these movements for social justice, which I think is really important to note as well.
Absolutely. That's a really good point.
Yes. And to just add my perspective to this as well, something that I have observed is when we consider the positive impact of AI, one thing, and I guess the language that we like to use, I've observed it used in academia and also in the public sector, is AI for public good. And a lot of the enabling technologies, 5G, hybrid satellite, cellular constellations, virtual reality, and even just having the compute capacity and GPUs manufactured, and microchips by like Intel and NVIDIA, even ARM, all of these enable us to not only build a mesh that can connect the world's information systems, but who uses and consumes that information? Humans, us. And we can use that to also connect ourselves as well. It's funny because I actually heard a quote recently at dinner yesterday where someone said, I think that the only two industries that call people users are basically illicit drugs and literally social media. Right. And so, right. And it's funny that we began this entire conversation discussing addiction and social media. But, one thing to consider is, how do we recruit that connectivity and use it to almost ameliorate and to heal our entire, not just population, but our earth from within. I think one of the keys that I want to return us to is bringing people into the real world, right? I think in all the examples that you described, these platforms are powerful because they let us engage with the real world. And so a platform that keeps you in the virtual digital twin will only further divest you from who your authentic self is. But platforms that can help us really connect both the cords within ourselves as well as the physical ties that we have in the real world, hopefully after the COVID pandemic chills out, then I think those are effective and mindful uses and powerful opportunities for AI to be recruited for public good. Yeah.
That's amazing. Well, We have 3 minutes left in the hour. So I wanted to, this is September is Self-Care Awareness Month. And so just to leave it open to the floor, I wanted to ask what do you guys do for self-care? And if somebody is struggling with depression and moving away from social media, maybe they need to take a break. Do you guys have any recommendations for those individuals?
I can jump in. What I do is I tend to kind of be a little bit more creative. So I tend to use my hands. I'm really into cross stitching right now. So I find that it's helpful to kind of keep my hands going, and I can just like get lost in a pattern. So that's kind of what I'm doing now for self-care. And I also like to listen to books, audiobooks. So I feel like I can do that and cross stitch at the same time, which is really helpful. And then the thing that I can share with people around social media is just remember that people are not their social media presence, and you are not your social media presence. And like, you have to kind of distinguish the two. And I think that helps people to kind of have a better framework for how they look at how they look at other people online.
That was really great. Thank you for sharing that.
Nicely said. Interesting question, because I wrote an article, what is your therapist doing for self-care? It's on Thrive Global if anyone wants to read it.
Nice.
But a little snapshot is, for me, it's how I start my day. And so I don't just rush into it. I take the time to, take a little bit of that walk, sipping my coffee slowly, maybe even doing like a 15-minute loving kindness meditation to ground myself, and then leaning into, work. And then continuing to set breaks during the day, because especially now with everything being remote, I think there's a tendency for burnout, even for therapists and for a lot of people that's happening. And so just taking those breaks and just doing something simple, like I'm going to take a 10-minute pause, have a snack, nourish myself, breathe, and then transition back in. And maybe that's actually what I want to say to everybody right now is, even just taking those moments is a way of self-care. It doesn't have to be this huge, grand thing that sometimes is kind of promoted even in social media, that now people feel like if they're not doing self-care, they're doing something wrong. They're failing at self-care. Just take small, simple moments, little daily acts of things to just help yourself. And it doesn't have to be anything huge. Take a bit of those breaks, set those boundaries.
That's awesome. Thank you. That's really good.
Yes, and I pretty much agree with both of you. Keeping your hands active as well as meditation are key. My routine basically consists of I wake up, I go to this little corner in my house, and I meditate for 30 minutes. And there's a wealth of practices. There's sutras you can use. I'm a fan of the 6-phase meditation by Mind Valley's Vishen Lakhiani. If you guys want to check that out, it's great. And for people who are afraid of getting started with meditation, my advice is really just start with 10 seconds of breath and then just add 5 seconds every day. That's how I began in 2017. Yeah. And these little incremental, like 1% increases over 3 years, like now doing 30 minutes on the ground is no problem, but it began with 10 seconds.
True. That is so true.
Very true.
That's a great meditation. Yep.
Yeah, I love it.
Well, thank y'all for sharing. I am just blown away by information. I definitely have to watch this video again because I need to Google some of this stuff. It was amazing. I really appreciate you guys joining Seedbox Digital today. We are right at the top of the hour at 12:01 p.m. I'm just going to drop a couple of banners down here so everyone could see where to find whom. Lujuana Milton, thank you so much for joining us. Here's all her socials down here. You can also watch the video. We have Babita Spinelli, can be found at openingthedoorsTherapy.com. Thank you again for joining us. And last but certainly not least, Mr. Sean Batir. He can be found on YouTube, and you can also find him on LinkedIn. Very lively discussion. I thank you all so much for joining us. And you know what? Happy Self-Care September. And we'll see you guys soon. Take care, everyone.
It was great meeting
Thanks
all
so
of you.
much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yes.
Oh, okay, I ended the broadcast. I'm like, oh my God, I'm like sweating. Guys, people were texting me. They're like, guys, this is so good. Oh my God. People. And then I was like, okay, I can't respond right now. But like they were, oh my gosh, everyone. Oh, thank you for the knowledge and input.
Oh, that's sweet.
Oh, thank you. This is great.
This was awesome.
You guys, I really enjoyed like this. I did, I was honestly, it was more so because I wanted to learn from y'all because you guys are such a wealth of knowledge. Like all I had to do was sit back really and just let y'all speak. So I really enjoyed this. If you guys wanted to do something else in the future, if there's like a topic of interest, I'm happy to facilitate that and put a panel together as well. And we'll have way more time than this. So y'all,
I think that would be fun. I think we should definitely brainstorm and think of something because I think, first of all, I think even personally, like I really enjoyed this